international network of researchers who are going to study the Arctic and to change in the Arctic. And our goal here today is to discuss Arctic security transformation and look at what is happening and hearing the views of those speakers that we have invited. But before I give the foreign visitors the floor, I want to ask Njáll Trausti Friðbertsson, who is the chairman of Arberg, who is sponsoring the seminar, to take the floor and say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Björn. I think I'm just speaking English today with a distinguished guest. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And good to see how many you are here today. And we are expecting a very good discussion about the very vital topics that, and we're going to discuss them today. And we are seeing a big change in the North Atlantic, the northern part, and Nordic and in NATO, what it's talk about, and the northern flank. It's maybe just easy. I'm also the deputy chair of the Icelandic Foreign Affairs Committee and the chairman of the Icelandic delegation to NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And so I have many hats concerning those issues. And here today we are focusing on Arctic security transformation. And Varberg and the Institute of International Affairs have co-organized the seminar with a new Nordic network on Nordic security strategy and the Royal Danish Defence College. We can all see that the Arctic security has been changing quite rapidly in the last years, and maybe especially from 2018. And it will be interesting to listen to our speakers here today and their thoughts about the situation, how they see the future concerning those issues. 24th of February this year, the same night as the Russian invasion into Ukraine started, I was attending Interparliamentary Conference for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, CFSP, and the Common Security and Defense Policy in the French Senate as a member of the Icelandic Foreign Affairs Committee. At that conference, just in the morning, the war started in the night, and we started our meeting 8 or 9 in the morning. And one of the first lecturers was a professor from the Sorbonne University in security issues and geopolitics. And she just started to say, you have to know what happened tonight, this night. Everything changed, and probably for the next 20, 25 years concerning security and defense of Europe and this in the area. And we have been seeing that happening now since then for almost now 8 months, and how fast the changes have been. So this is a very interesting times that we are seeing, and of course we have seen with Sweden and Finland the big change there, the big change with Germany, just 3 days after the invasion, and on Sunday morning they changed actually everything in Germany concerning those issues. And of course we can see it in Finland and Sweden, what happened. In the beginning of the year, 26% of the Finnish people were for be a part of NATO, but at this moment probably 75 to 80%. It changed just in a few days, few weeks. And we are also seeing a big change now in with the strategic concept of NATO 22 that was accepted in Madrid by the heads of state and government, heads of state and governments of the NATO countries in end of June. And I think it's quite interesting what it says in that paper. We remain steadfast on our resolve to protect our 1 billion citizens, defend our territory, and safeguard our freedom and democracy. We will reinforce our unity, cohesion, and solidarity, building on the enduring transatlantic bond between our nations and the strengths of our shared democratic values. We reiterate our steadfast commitment in the North Atlantic Treaty and to defending each other from all threats, no matter where they stem from. It's also interesting to see the meeting of the Nordic Prime Ministers in Oslo, 15th of August. And it's quite different views from the Nordic countries concerning those issues. And I should have had the text, but I also have my time limit here. So I'm not going to maybe go into that, but we can see there's a fundamental change concerning Nordic cooperation and the NORDEFCO with that. So that's very important to have that in mind, and it will be interesting to hear from our specialists concerning those issues. I'm also quite especially excited to hear from our specialist about Greenland, our neighboring country, about the defense and security in that dimension from Greenland. You always think you have so much time when you write some points down, but I'm just going to read a few of them, actually. But I think also Björn Bjarnason made a quite important report in 2020 for the Nordic Foreign Affairs Ministers concerning some of the issues that we are talking about here today. And issues like hybrid threats, cybersecurity, cables in the sea. So that's also a very, I think, important mission, thing to talk about. It's also just one mention, maybe because it goes quite fast. I think the security policy of Europe and the energy policy of Europe are really the same issue. And now we have learned that was happened. We started to talk about it in the NATO PA 3-4 years ago. And we didn't expect it to happen that fast. But I think that's also important when you're talking about the northern flank and those issues concerning northern part of Europe. Joint expeditionary force is also of interest to Iceland. We became a part of it 1 or 2 years ago with the other Nordic and the Baltic countries, and the Netherlands and the UK. So that's also maybe a issue. But I think my time is almost off. But I think just the final maybe point is that I think it's very important for the Nordic countries and the Baltics to be a part of NATO, not play it like a special division inside of NATO. To see to find out that we are all in this together, that it won't be a special part. So, and I have also heard that from, for example, Admiral Robert Bauer, when I met here in Iceland only a month ago. That might be an interesting focus to keep that in mind, that the Nordic and the Baltic, they are part of NATO. They will not be playing when Finland and Sweden become a part, that you're not going to play this like another league inside of NATO. So, but I'm just looking very much forward to our discussion, and I will also see you, some of our specialists here, 15 of them in the Parliament in the morning. So I also have a good time there to ask some questions about those issues. But thank you.
Now I give the floor to Pia Hansson, the director of the International Institute at the university, who is also an organizer of the conference.
Thank you very much, Björn. And thank you for the collaboration on putting together this event. We're very happy to be here in Veröld with you all. This is Veröld, the House of Vigdís. This auditorium is called Auðarsalur. I thought I would mention that as well. We're very proud of this auditorium, and we use it quite a bit. I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the IAA, of which I am the director, before I leave you in the capable hands of our moderator today, for, of course, a very important and interesting discussion. We are indeed facing challenging times. in the world today. Nationalism and populism is on the rise. Mis- and disinformation and fake news, distorting our views on what is true and what not. We have bleak reports on how well we're tackling the effects of climate change, the greatest challenge of them all. And we have war in Europe, practically on our doorstep. The future seems bleak, to say the least. In these challenging times, the need for research collaboration is ever more important. The Institute of International Affairs remains invested in strengthening Iceland's knowledge base, and now, of course, with a particular focus on security studies in light of what I just described. For a small, non-military state like Iceland, it is crucial to nurture a strong and vibrant research community. We are witnessing the liberal world order being challenged. Respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democracy diminishing. These values are of key importance to the small Nordic states and should be protected constantly. Independent and high-quality research about international relations is an important element in our democratic societies. Researchers contribute to public policy and debate by analyzing and researching many of the burning international issues affecting our societies. It is therefore of great value to our institute to lead a new Horizon Europe project called Reclaiming Liberal Democracy in the Post-Factual Age, or RECLAIM. The project aims to analyze disinformation in Europe and use the results to advise on policymaking, education, and actions to react to the negative effect of disinformation on democratic discourse and the basic structure of modern liberal democracy. And we have a few more projects as well that I'd like to boost about since I do have the floor. Let me mention ACONA, the Arms Control Negotiation Academy, a highly selective program that runs for a year and trains 16 emerging international security leaders in arms control history, technology, and negotiations, with the goal to generate new ideas about the future of arms control. And finally, I'd also like to mention ARCADE, the Arctic Academy for Social and Environmental Leadership, that aims to answer a call for innovative ways to meet the challenge of the fast-changing Arctic, with a leadership program that focuses on creative solutions with an interdisciplinary approach, and that's the key word there. Our partners in crime, some of whom are here, are, for example, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø and the University of Greenland in Nuuk. We also have partners with the Arctic Initiative at Harvard's Belfer Center, and at Arctic Circle they do get to present after their 10-month-long program. 1 week they're spending in Tromsø, 1 week they're spending here in Iceland, and the third week in Greenland. And finally, they will present their solutions at the Arctic Circle next year. Very interesting program. Actually still open for applications, I'd like to mention, until next Monday. So to sum it up, there are all kinds of opportunities in research collaboration. As a small state, we need to be constantly vigilant in pursuing new opportunities to contribute to our goal of expanding and deepening our knowledge to be better able to cope with the challenges we all face globally. And over to our moderator, Björn Bjarnason. Thank you very much.
Well, we have 3 speakers, and I want to make clear that this is streamed, and also it will be on YouTube afterwards. So everything here is on the record, and also we will have at the end a microphone going around if people want to ask questions. And after the meetings here, we have light refreshments in the other room, and we can enjoy the company of each other there. We intend to end at 6 o'clock at the latest. Earlier, if people want to go to have the drinks earlier, then we will stop earlier. That is up to you. But this is the format, and I would ask the speakers after they have given their lectures to sit down here at the table, and we will have a panel discussion afterwards. And I could also maybe call on some of our guests to come up here and make some remarks that could be of interest. But then we start, and the first speaker is Professor Gunnhild Høgesen Gjørv, professor at the Arctic University in Norway, and I give her the floor. I ask the speakers also to give some information on what they are doing and put this into the framework of the research. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shit. It's disappeared. Okay, yes. The Chrome disappeared, but see, it disappeared. I did that 2 times.
Yeah.
Yes. And I have this here to start my 20 minutes. And it's going to scare the shit out of me. I'm just going to say it right now when it goes off. So, because of course we'll take much too long. Here, I was all organized to find the Google Chrome thing.
It might be my fault because of the technicalities.
Oh,
I think you will have to find it
Okay,
again.
I have to do it again. Yes. Okay. This doesn't count. This doesn't count. Hold on. There we go. Yeah. Oh, shh. Okay. I will start with, actually, and thank you for the opening remarks, and I will take advantage of what you just said was to say something about ourselves and situate the work that I'm doing in this talk I'm giving today. I have posted here, this is the website for a research group at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. It's called the Grey Zone. Some of you may have seen this in the news in the last little while, because I lead this particular group. I'm a professor of security studies. I work at what's called the Center for Peace Studies at the University in Tromsø. And this is a research group that I lead. And apparently it was possibly, because we don't know, it's not confirmed, this was an attractive site to end up for a person who came to us as an unpaid intern for roughly a year's, I thought it was going to be a little under a year, period. So someone who is wanting to brush up his master's degree that he actually took in Canada at a very good university there as well, University of Calgary. Here I can say this is the research group that has been profiled, because the focus of this research group is taking a look at hybrid threats, but in particular understanding the under threshold, that is under Article 5, that without using sort of traditional military attacks, that which is actually occurring within the civilian domain. So what kind of threats are occurring within the civilian domain is what we're interested in, and to what degree can we mitigate these sorts of threats? I can just sort of mention that one can go looking around for about and all that, but under the Arctic here you will see arcade, which was just mentioned by Pia. So we're trying to also highlight in particular what this threat picture looks like in this thing called the Arctic, because what I would argue is that in the Arctic context, as has been mentioned already, that like on the 24th of February, the security picture has changed, not just for the Arctic but over Europe and particular the North Atlantic. So. What does this mean for the Arctic is probably not a traditional military attack into the Arctic. However, we do see that the Arctic is subjected to threats underneath the threshold, and a wide variety of these threats. You know what? I actually forgot to turn on my timer, so I don't know. Someone here will tell me to shut up. I want to mention this, the gray zone here. I don't know, maybe we'll go back up to the top part, or there we go. It's a fun picture, I think. As you're probably well aware, so we have a suspected spy in the area. Which is kind of an understatement. It was rather a shocking kind of a revelation. But at the same time, it is, if you see it in the longer perspective, it's in a history where this has actually been taking place over a long period of time. But we need to understand sort of the context of the Arctic when we're thinking of, these sort of under-threshold activities. This can include cyber attacks on infrastructure, which occur and affect the civilian domain. It can be sabotage, which we also know from the is it Baltic Sea? Baltic Sea, is that right? Yes. And incur espionage, spying, and also, not least, disinformation and disinformation in our regions. And we're seeing increasing amounts of this. But it affects this Arctic region in very different ways, because what we often have termed as the Arctic, or I don't know, it's we. In general, there's this thing called this region called the Arctic, which isn't really a classic region. It's not bound by state boundaries. In fact, depending on how we decide how Iceland is defined, but if you take a look at the map, take a map of the Arctic, there's not even agreement on what is the Arctic, what's included. Is it the Arctic Circle, which contains the Arctic, or is it about climate and different types of climate conditions that determine the Arctic, such as the AMA picture, or is it the AD, the Arctic Human Development Report, which has been given out in 2004 and 2014, which also has a more socio-political kind of understanding of what the Arctic is. If we take the AHDR understanding of the Arctic, we see nevertheless that we have to split the Arctic up according to who is living there. In the North American side of the Arctic, it is the dominant population are indigenous peoples, but in the European and the Russian sides of the Arctic, the dominant populations are non-indigenous peoples. And the amount of people across this thing called the Arctic is very different. And of course, as I was saying, it's not a region that is bound by country boundaries, by borders, but rather is this funny little line where the vast majority, Iceland then is within the AHDR region. Iceland is the only one that has a capital within the Arctic. The other countries have capitals outside of the Arctic. So all of this impacts the dynamics of what's happening within these regions, and we have to understand these regions. And I think I'm preaching to the converted, because pretty much everyone here knows what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, it's more important now today than ever before. And my focus is on the European Arctic, which can also be considered this Nordic Arctic, or the northern flank, which has been, in NATO-ease, we can call it, or the northern fortress. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting part of the Arctic because we're quite highly populated given the territory that we have in this particular Arctic concept or understanding what the Arctic is. Prior to, I don't know when it started changing really, but there was a period of time, particularly after the end of the Cold War, that a term which many of you are undoubtedly familiar with, which was characterizing the Arctic as being somewhat exceptional. There was something about crossing that line. You just cross it over, like, it's exceptional. I would argue it's not, just because of the fact that there was no real desire to engage in overt military conflict in this region. We also saw, of course, as we know, a lot more type of cooperative initiatives, including with Russia. Russia did outwardly present a more, I would say, I don't know, sophisticated, or at least a greater interest for cooperation earlier on in the 90s. It did start to change somewhat, but albeit slowly. NATO was not presented as the enemy as it is presented now, not in the same terms, not using the same narratives. So these are things that have changed over time. But this notion of this Arctic exceptionalism was a sort of became almost a reified condition of understanding peace in the Arctic, and like that's how it is in this particular region, no matter how we're choosing to define it. One of the problems with this understanding was that it also reified who are the actors in the Arctic. This notion of peace is very much centered around military activities, and that is the purview of the state. And I'm kind of interested in the purview that is, well, within the state, and actually the civilian domain, going to sub-state actors, and actually the role of conflict within sub-state actors. Of course, even on the state side, we did see a lot of sort of increasing narratives and also activities, one could say, about sort of a militarization of the Arctic or a remilitarization of the Arctic, really depending on what your perspective was. But nevertheless, the interest to engage in military activity or overt military activity has always been low. And I think that remains. The thing is, as I said, that within the state, and that is like taking a look at not just what is traditionally referred to as state security, but when we take a look at societal security, something that I forget which colleagues of ours were just learning about societal. I think that also must you were just learning about societal security, which is taking a look at a lot of readiness and preparedness, particularly for natural disasters or types of crises, but also apply in war. And some of the Nordic states employ a concept called total defense, which allows for this sort of broader conception. But what these conceptions also need to take on board, and from my point of view, and I mean this is very relevant for the European Arctic, is individual security. I don't call this human security because individual security is actually a much broader spectrum than what is known as human security, because human security has a very sort of moral focus and inclusive focus. I mean, it has a lot of problems. I'll just say that conceptually. But nevertheless, there's this moral agenda of ensuring that people, regardless of whom they are, that they have access to what makes the good life, in a sense. And that's human security. So freedom from fear and freedom from want. And it's this moral agenda to ensure that everybody has this. Individual security may not necessarily, can range from that, but also ranges in categories where people may see it in an exclusive way. That is, people who may see the rights and privileges of some people as being a threat to themselves. I go back to what Pia was talking about, because this is where we see in populist types of expressions. Not all populism is exclusive. Not all populism is us against the other, but or at least it is elite, usually elite against the people. But certain forms of populism have become popular, trying to articulate what, as the people, we want to have against the elites. And when the elites have been talking about important measures with regards to climate change, but the people say, no, you're not doing what we want to do. When the elites are talking about rights for LGBTQIA2+, 2S+, so gender perspectives, there are, in some populist rhetoric, an interest to say, no, that does not represent what we're interested in. The elites who are talking about rights for migrants, for example, have also been used in populist ways to say that is not reflecting what we're interested in. And my point is that actually rights and have been construed in certain political narratives in some countries, including in many democratic countries, to be a threat to a notion of the people. And this is important because these issue areas, which seem to be far away from notions of Arctic or notions of state security, and think, what the hell do I need to know all this for? It is because it's the civilian domain where a lot of these are fired off, where our existing vulnerabilities, you could say, in our existing vulnerabilities are prejudices we have, and just totally sort of inside, kind of like, I'm not sure about you. It's looking at our trust. It's going after our trust. So in societies where there is lower trust, and this makes the Nordic countries very interesting because we not only have high levels of trust, we often take for granted that we have high levels of trust. These are things that are nevertheless under attack, you could say. And so these types of perspectives can be used, because the thing is, if you can polarize a society, and this we're learning, of course, more and more about the use of mis and disinformation. By the misinformation is wrong information. I can also say, with regards to all this stuff about the spy and stuff like that, I suddenly became the dean of a new faculty of security studies that does not exist. But I'm going to take this to my university leadership and see if I can get a raise. But like, that is an example of wrong information. Disinformation, on the other hand, is information that's used to try to politically manipulate a segment of the population. And you don't need to manipulate everybody, but a critical mass that could be enough to polarize a state. So in today's Arctic, we have polarizing issues. We have polarizing issues about the climate. We have polarizing issues about where we stand on Russia. In some democratic countries, there is disinformation that is actually functioning well because it's targeting already preconceived opinions and notions about Russia's position with regards to Ukraine and with regards to its war and its aggressions towards Ukraine that hit for some populations. We've seen, like, I think it was only a couple of weeks ago, a report came out taking a look at the population in Germany, and that there's a huge sort of disinformation campaign going into Germany, but where it's generating sympathy with around 30% of the population. I don't remember the number, but nevertheless, a significant number of the population, where some of the narratives that are making the intervention into Ukraine as something, as a purely defensive matter, and that Russia is not doing anything wrong, that these arguments are actually landing. And what is the point of that? To create these types of divisions. In the case of the Arctic, I can say what is the case with Norway? We've been seeing more recently, we have a history of actually espionage having taken place in Norway, and in the Arctic in particular. We've had, in the 1970s, it was discovered under the WikiLeaks exposure, if you remember that happened not so long ago, that in the 1970s there was an attempt to put in a Russian consulate in Tromsø, actually for activities that were meant more for espionage, trying to find sympathetic opinions, people with sympathetic opinions, and potentially who could be used further on to help both strengthen the Soviet Union and its posturing, but also as a way to try to destabilize the state from within. We had in the 1980s what's called the Treholt case, and this is a Norwegian person who was acting as an agent for the then Soviet Union, and this was also in the north and taking pictures in Porsanger, where it was a very important military base. In the last few months even, there have been drone activities, and there was someone in an earlier talk who was talking about, it was Anna Maria, I think you were talking about drones. Are they military or are they not military? And that's really interesting, because we're looking at the blurring of the lines of what is military and what is not military. If a civilian is using a drone, taking pictures, whoops, by accident, is that just a tourist making a dumb move? Or is this a military activity to try to gain intelligence about sensitive regions within the you know, and these drones just happen to be around airports and stuff like that, you know, so, and sensitive areas, I'm sure that's a typical tourist locations. They weren't at Prekestolen or something like that, so, which is actually very nice to be at too, as well. So these activities have been going on for a long time, and we're seeing an increased level of these activities now. We are seeing that, and these are being also reported in the media. And it's a very interesting thing that's happening that we can see. We are seeing these activities, and now, of course, there was the spy thing as well. But there's the reporting in the media. On the one hand, we can feel, in the Norwegian case, we can feel secure that these sorts of incidences are being caught. You know, that's okay. You know, our police security services have control, and they know what's going on, and it's being reported on. At the same time, without having an open dialogue about what this means in our society, it can also lead to increased unrest within society and wondering, well, what is the capabilities of the Norwegian government and the Norwegian security services, what actually is going on while these drones are being you know, captured or being sent to, the people who are running the drones are being sent to prison, or at least accused of using these drones for illicit purposes. Russia has been saying this is against Russians, this is taking innocent tourists, and those narratives also play in society to a certain degree. So what this is doing, it's having multiple effects in our society, where on the one hand we're seeing increased activity that can increase insecurity. We see that there's our services, our security services are seeming to handle this. Well, that could give some increased sense of security. But at the same time that these things are being reported on, and the media are playing a very interesting role here as well. We need to talk about the responsibility of the media in our societies, the ways in which they may be framing these sorts of incidences. Can nevertheless, we're sitting here in sort of a balance of influencing the general population. And it's being influenced both from external actors, but also making use of existing insecurities within society already. So this is what we're seeing that is sort of moving up and down. And why is this important? One, it's because most of these threats, as I said, are taking place within the civilian domain. There is no military solution to these sorts of issues. It has to be dealt with within the civilian domain. A second thing is the role of information. And this is so important to democratic societies, and these societies, again, in the Arctic. And why, of course, like to bring it back to the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic region is crucially important, and this has been said again and again and again, not just in Norway by Norwegian politicians, but elsewhere, that the security of the North is integral to the security of the entire countries of which we speak. So these are very important. But the thing is that we also need to think about this in terms of like how we deal with these issues in democratic societies. In the case of the spy, and I won't be taking much longer, I don't know how much time I have, In the case of our spy guy, so it was, as many things have been reported, again, some fantastic stuff, and again, I should ask for a raise, but it is about, well, the research that the spy was interested in the research at UIT, great, but everything we're doing is unclassified and using open source information. Yeah, but nevertheless, it should be with, it should anyways be called sensitive information. But how do you treat, and this is for all of us as researchers, how do you deal with open information where you have to talk, have dialogue, and cooperate with society, say about the society's role within total defense, for example? How do you have that conversation and call it sensitive and say it's sort of locked in a box somewhere over here? We can't do it. We cannot do that research. Yet that research is integral for improving our capacities at resilience. And that means we need to have a constant dialogue. And that actually is completely depending on the system of democracy that we have. It's dependent on openness. It's dependent on access. Some things that have also been said, we should just be talking to allies. There should be projects only with allies involved, which is a fantastic idea, unless you have a sleeper agent who happened to get Anna Chapman, anybody, who had a British passport going to the UK. That's an ally. So it's so difficult to, and there have been these conversations, it's been really interesting with the spy thing, about closing research. How do you close doors? Who should be let in? Who should be let out? How are we going to start checking people out for their passports? Now, of course, that's the police services and our immigration services who have that job, not universities. But imagine that we have to start second-guessing who we're talking to. Imagine we have to second-guess people who just want like a student role, as this one person did. It wasn't going into a PhD program or anything like that, but wants just a student role, and our job is to support students, let them have internships, because that's where they're going to be learning. Imagine that we can't do that anymore. And that actually becomes a win for the other side. If we close down our universities and start second-guessing. The security services and migration services need to be doing their jobs, and they're learning more and more about this, just as we're learning more and more. We need to talk about, well, what can be considered classified sort of information. I should just say that the projects in this thing here, and there's actually we have more than these, but these projects, there was no access by the alleged spy to any of the data in these projects, because they're actually held separately than within the research group, just to make sure about that. But it's a funny position we find ourselves in. And because Arctic universities or Arctic-based universities are going to become more and more a target, they have been before and we will be again, in all sorts of different ways, and particularly if you have an illegalist or a sleeper agent, they're kind of two different things, but nevertheless, they've been making identities or creating identities over many, many years. It's really difficult if it's up to us at universities to be second-guessing these sorts of things. And because of the fact that security in the Arctic, and that's the work that we're doing with our communities, because our communities are now a prime target for these under-threshold types of threats, that we have to make sure that we retain this sort of openness and accessibility with communities, and we're much better to build up our resilience based on open source information than the enemy is able to use that open source information against us, according to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Jeppe Stansberg, Associate Professor at the Royal Danish Defence College.
Hello, and thank you very much for the kind and very short notice invitation. I have some PowerPoint somewhere. There you go. Does what? Yeah. I am employed by the Royal Defence College, but I'm also associated with and work at Ilisimatusarfik, the university in Greenland. And there I'm associated with a center called Nasifik. Nasifik is both a restaurant down the harbor, so you have to be careful where you end up if you Google it. Quite often people drinking beer and singing songs outside. But it's also a research center for foreign and security policy. Nasifik means a lookout post where you see things from. In Canada, in Nunavut, there's a corporation called Natituk, which is the same thing. They provide surveillance contracts for the Canadian Army. Anyway, I'm saying that because I'm interested in some of the things I'm working with is how security looks different from Greenland, both because of a particular history and maybe a particular culture. Inuit organizations are quite good at talking about security as being something else than military security. The geography of Greenland means that security looks very different. I think Henrik, you once, my colleague, once assessed an exercise that should simulate an attack on a power station. And you said, like, why on earth would you do that? If you attack a town, where do you go from there? There are no roads, you can't go anywhere. So security in Greenland means something else than it means in Northern Europe. Apart from that, I'm interested in questions of geography, law, and security. I've been working with continental shelves and what they mean for our discussions of security. But this is not what I'm going to talk about today. And if you want to know, and Bjørn, you mentioned the perspective from Greenland, I think if you want to know more about Greenland, I'm very happy to talk about it, and you feel free to ask questions afterwards. What I'm going to talk about today is a project that is, and this is why it's going to be funny, it's a project that has not been made yet. We're going to talk about an article I'm writing with my two colleagues over here called The Kingdom at the Crossroads. And I'm going to say something about the motivation for writing it, and talk about the stuff that we find interesting writing about it. And then I'm also going to say a bit about a special issue that both you and that all the speakers are writing about, called Arctic transformations. So, where we start from is the question of grand narratives in the discussion of Arctic security and Arctic politics. I've been outside academia, but I started following the debate around 2008, 2009. And then I've been out and back again. And those of you that have followed Arctic politics for longer can probably add to that. I might have a different perspective on this. But it seems to me that there are these grand narratives or established truths that govern how we commentators overall look at the Arctic. In the 2010s, you couldn't write an article on an analytical piece without mentioning shipping lanes, oil and gas in the underground continental shelves, up against a background of climate change, and maybe with a sort of uncanny fear of militarization in the background, but we didn't quite know what to do about it. It was always the same things that we talked about. And then sometime during the late 2010s and early 2020s, we have a new narrative. It's about security and militarization of the Arctic. We start from the observation that great power rivalry and escalating military build-up are changing the Arctic. The question is whether this is true, whether it's helpful. And I don't think we want to suggest that there's not a military build-up, that there's not an increase or changing security dynamic, but sometimes we maybe have to be careful not to repeat these grand narratives every time we write something or talk about the Arctic. I'm actually going to think that it's related to what you talk about Arctic exceptionalism. Yes, there might be something special about the Arctic, but if we keep saying the same thing every time we start the conversations, we might just be a repeat political dogma. And then those of you that might have heard me say something before might be tired of me because I'm always repeating this quote, and I should also apologize for Corinne Gray, whom I talked to in 2011 in Ottawa. She was then executive director of the ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And she didn't know that I was going to quote this 10 years later. We were just having a conversation, but the reason I use it is that this is one of the first times it really hit me in the face how much you overlook if you come with these sort of a bit dogmatic views on what is going on. Because I came to her to talk about questions of emerging geopolitics in the Arctic. After the Russian flag planting and after the US Geological Survey had published their estimates of how much oil and gas we could find in the seabed, and all these things that made all the media across the West, especially in the Anglo-speaking world, obsessed with the Arctic and this new race for the Arctic. And she looked at me and said, you know, geopolitics is not new to the Inuit. obviously, there's nothing surprising in this, but it's just the way that she said it. The colonial context was also always about ownership and control over land. What is new, she said, might be the territorialization of politics in the Arctic. And this is different. And that just made me aware of, be more specific and start from a different place sometimes when you discuss what's going on in the Arctic. Anyway, this is partly what motivated us to make a call for a special issue of a journal called Scandinavian Journal of Military Studies, where we invite writers from different areas, different regions, dealing with different issues, to discuss changes in strategic and operative environments in the Arctic, exactly to get a sense of what is actually changing and what might not be changing if you get closer to practice, rather than having this overall picture. At first, we wanted to but theorize some of the quite impressive work that Rasmus Dahlberg over here is dealing with in a project about a history of warfare and military in the Kingdom of Denmark, which is, according to yourself, a history of the GI-UK gap. And what we see from this, okay, that looks really odd. It looks better on the screen. But what clearly comes out of this is how the different existing and previous members of the Danish kingdom have very different strategic cultures and strategic priorities, which have been decided by their particular history and their geographical location. We didn't do this either. We do another project. If you want to know more about it, you can talk to Rasmus. Instead, we focus on the Danish military presence in the Arctic, in the, so far, one and only political strategy, Arctic strategy of the Kingdom of the Arctic, published in 2010. It was announced to merge the former Faroese Command and the Greenlandic Command into a joint Arctic command located in Greenland. This was presented, as I remember it, when this strategy was published. It was presented as a sort of a boost an increasing in the capacity of the Danish defense in the Arctic. There were a lot of intentions in this strategy, but it was also a strategy that was being criticized for being a bit wordy without the money. I think this is quite common criticism that you can often raise towards a strategy. But this is also one of the questions we're going to discuss, and now I'm just mixed up the order. I'm just going to show a picture. Last Monday, the Joint Arctic Command had its 10-year anniversary. And the Vice Commander on the right, Paul Primdal, was given a new flag in a very nice, beautiful ceremony to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Joint Arctic Command. And I want to stress that I think most people around Greenland and Faroe Islands believe that the Joint Arctic Command is doing an awful lot with the material they have. I spoke to the US Defense Attaché in Denmark last week, and I think he said, or posted on LinkedIn, that he didn't know of any military command that did as much with the resources they had at hand as the Joint Arctic Command. And these are the experts, according to him, in operating in the Arctic region. They do sovereignty enforcement, they do search and rescue missions, they support research, and they support, they're part of the societal resilience, emergency preparedness if there's a power cut, if things go wrong. And generally, they just do an awful lot of things that are not usually a military task. Okay. But the question we want to ask is, why was this Joint Arctic Command established, and why was it located in Nuuk? In this the last 10 minutes, next 5-10 minutes, I'm going to focus on the first question: why was this established? Because when you look at the first announcement of the Joint Arctic Command, that comes in the Danish Defence Agreement that covers the years 2000 and 2014. It doesn't say that it's an increase in the capacity or it should increase the Danish defence presence in the Arctic. It says, and this is it's my quick translation, I don't want to take you on board. It says we will rationalize in order to make the North Atlantic operative command structure more efficient. And this sounds like a cost-cutting exercise. And this is also, and I can reveal that now, this is also our working hypothesis, that the establishment of the Joint Arctic Command was a cost-cutting exercise and not a strategic decision to increase the presence of the Danish armed forces. In the Defence Commission that led to the Defence Agreement in 2008, the only thing that we've been able to find about the Arctic is this statement that is also a quite rough translation. They write, the countries of the region have already started positioning themselves as well as they can in order to be ready for expected developments in the Arctic, for example through maritime presence. Canada, Norway are prioritizing the northern areas. Then they mention the Russian unilateral actions, I don't know, and concerns about where do we have Russia. And then they mentioned, again, concern that the US does not want to take on regional leadership. And Denmark at this point was really quite, this was a time where Denmark was engaged in war in Afghanistan and in the Middle East and was not, generally criticized for not generally criticized. There were emerging critical voices that Denmark didn't take its Arctic presence seriously enough compared to, for example, Norway and Canada, that were very strong in an Arctic rhetoric. But what is one of the striking things that we find in this is that after the establishment of the Joint Arctic Command, it was decided to commence a larger mapping of the tasks of the Danish defence forces in the Arctic. But that came after. So you establish a Joint Arctic Command, and then afterwards you find out what are the future tasks of the Danish defence forces. And here I'm going to point out to the audience again, because luckily my boss and co-author Henrik, you were involved in this analytical work. Could you share some of the headlines and some of the main findings in this? Would that be okay? He knew before that I was going to ask him.
You would have been surprised if I said no, right?
Yeah.
No, as Jeppe correctly said, the defense agreement from 2008, was 2010 to 2014, also pointed out that there should be an analysis of the future task for the Danish armed forces in the Arctic. And I was lucky to be a part of the secretariat that were gathering the analysis. And what was very not normal at that period of time was that we had a very wide participation from a lot of different ministries and agencies in Denmark. So we actually look at a very wide perspective and looked at all areas. And actually, the funny thing was, while we were going on with the analysis, we actually find out that there was actually agencies in Denmark that bought services from the same provider, but they didn't know that another agency bought it. So actually, the Danish involvement in the Arctic wasn't mapped out. In general, we started out to just make a mapping of what could be done with no conclusion, but that changed during the process. And the general findings was, not surprisingly for those of you also have worn a uniform, was that we need to improve our surveillance in the Arctic. And for those who know the Joint Arctic Command, we have a fairly good maritime surveillance in the Arctic. We have a fairly bad air domain surveillance. Actually, we have non-air surveillance in the Arctic. So what we recommended to the political level was that we need to do more in surveillance in general. And then when we have surveillance, then we need to do more in command, control, and communication. And then thirdly, if we can see and we can command and control, then we need a capability so we actually can react on what we see. And that was finished in 2016, delivered to the Parliament, and then actually nothing happened with that analysis. Some small projects started, and the Joint Arctic Command got a little funding to something, but the recommendation wasn't put into political decision until Denmark needed to use some more money on defense spending due to a summit in Brussels. So suddenly there was a 1.5 billion Danish crowns that was put into an Arctic capability package too. And then it was actually good to see that the MOD looked at the recommendation from this analysis and actually be invested in surveillance and command and control. Not enough, but a good start for better Danish Arctic presence in the future.
No, I see you're clapping too early. No, but we can continue this discussion afterwards. But what some of the questions we're going to keep to ask, because we're going to do more work on this, is of course, I mean, to learn more about the political decision to establish the Joint Arctic Command and place it in Nuuk. But then also dig more into the relationship between the strategic analysis and these political decisions, because they seem to be not following in the order that you would expect. And you might also have the suspicion that the reason that we all talk about the Arctic, and I know this might have been changed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it seems at least that some of the headlines changed after Pompeo did his speech at the Arctic Council, after Trump offered to buy Greenland, after the US decided to be a leader or have a stronger presence in the Arctic. But so the argument that we often hear that, you know, the Russians have increased their presence, military presence in the Arctic, and that's why we're talking about security. Maybe this is not the entire truth. Maybe it's also because, you know, this is a response to a more general or global great power rivalry. And the question is then, what does this look like from a smaller state? How do you react? How do you navigate with this strategically? Because obviously, Russia is a threat, it's a concern, both in the Faroe Islands and in Greenland and the rest of the North Atlantic. But I believe also from a small operative command, it's also a challenge and an opportunity to deal with a lot of interest from your greatest ally that suddenly wants to do a lot of things. So if you go close to the tactical level, the question of strategic transformation and change and continuity might look a little bit different than it does from just looking at these general headlines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Rasmus Gjedsø Bertelsen, who is an Ansel professor at the University of Akureyri, but comes from the Arctic University in Tromsø. Rasmus.
Ingen problem. Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's very good to be back at the University of Iceland. As you will see in a moment, I'm an old student from the University of Iceland. My name is Rasmus Gjedsø Bertelsen. I'm Danish, but I grew up here in Iceland. I'm a professor of Northern Studies at the Arctic University of Norway, colleague of Gunhild, and this year and next year I have the Nansen Professorship of Arctic Studies at University of Akureyri, which is part of the Norwegian Icelandic Arctic Studies program. Gunhild has held this position previously. The topic of my Nansen Professorship is the Barents region and the West Nordic region in the international system. So what I would like to share are some thoughts about the connection between world order and Arctic order. And that echoes very much what has been said previously, that there is absolutely nothing unique or exceptional about the Arctic. The Arctic, historically, today and in the future, reflects world order very closely. I want to take the opportunity to introduce myself and my background because I have this Nansen Professorship, and as I keep saying, that I hope to contribute as such, and I hope to take part in many things, and please reach out to me if I can be of value, of use. Tønne Svanes from the Norwegian Embassy is there. He is something between my agent and my political commissar. As you can see, I have a personal background growing up in Iceland. I was a pupil at Østerbergskolen in the mid-1980s. That's, of course, me on an Icelandic horse around that time. As I have often said to my students, if I hadn't been that boy on that Icelandic horse 35 years ago, I wouldn't be talking about the Arctic now. And of course I had the great privilege of having Vilborg Dagbjörnsdóttir, the poet and author, as I'm sure many of you knew, as my teacher, which of course was a huge influence on me. I later had the opportunity to be at Menntaskólann in Reykjavik, and then we've just been to see the president at Bessastaðir. And I visited Bessastaðir first time in September 96, when I was a new exchange student at the University of Iceland, and Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson was newly elected. It's a great tradition to receive foreign students at Bessastaðir. And the last picture is at the opening of Kárhóll, the China-Iceland Arctic Observatory, with Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, myself, and Dr. Yang Hugen, director of the Polar Research Institute of China. And as I keep repeating to people when I tell about the Icelandic society, it's the importance of a sigla, to sail, and how Iceland has benefited enormously from brain circulation. Icelanders going away, studying, working, and coming back. I say it's the basis of modern Icelandic society. And as you can see, I've very much inspired by my own upbringing in Iceland. I've benefited from that very much myself. I teach every year in China. The Chinese have the term haigui, sea turtle, which are Chinese who went abroad and came back. And they also have a very nice saying, which I cannot pronounce in Chinese, that it's better to travel 10,000 miles than to read 10,000 books. And I cannot encourage students enough to travel with their education. So, to the question of world order and Arctic order. Basically, as I say, the Arctic closely reflects world order. There's nothing exceptional about the Arctic. When we had the Cold War, we had a bipolar system, and we had in the Arctic, in the European Arctic, we had the Iron Curtain, and in the Bering Strait, we had the ice curtain between the Soviet Far East and Alaska. Then we had unipolarity, and that was the basis of a liberal circumpolar Arctic order, which I'll get back to in a moment. And now that unipolar order is disappearing or changing very much, and that of course raises the question, what does that mean for the Arctic? What does it mean for the Barents region and the West Nordic region? My argument will be that American unipolarity was the basis of globalization, economic globalization, but at the same time, that globalization undermined unipolarity. I don't think it's a very useful term to use the term rules-based order. I think what we're talking about is unipolarity and hegemony. So if we look quickly at you can talk about the Napoleonic Wars, you can talk about the 7-Year War and what it meant for the Arctic. The Napoleonic Wars had great influence on the Arctic. So that's another misconception, that international interest in the Arctic is something recent. Professor Emerita of History here at the University of Iceland, Anna Agnarsdóttir, has done great work on British and French strategic interest in Iceland in the 1700s. So of course, if we just take the Cold War, well, we had a bipolar order because we had two superpowers that were so much materially, economically, demographically, scientifically, technologically powerful than the next order of states. The Soviet Union was never more than 50% of the US economy, but they were still in a league of their own. And when you have two or more superpowers or great powers, you have security competition because of an anarchic order, and therefore you have a realist order. Now, it was in many ways a much simpler world, so these two superpowers, they only had to think about arms control, and they got arms control right, and that's why we are all still here. Such superpowers or great powers in security competition, they form bounded orders of their allies and clients to discipline and to mobilize those allies and clients. So, of course, the United States had the West in general, with organizations like NATO, the European Economic Communities, the GATT, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And of course, the Soviet Union had the Warsaw Pact, the Comecon Economic Cooperation. And how did that look in the Arctic? Well, we had a strictly bipolar Arctic, where in the Nordic and North American Arctic, you see some of these organizations. And then you had the Soviet Arctic on the other side, and you had very, very little contact between these two sides. You had some Norwegian-Soviet Fisheries Cooperation. You had the Polar Bear Treaty from the early 70s, and that was about it. Then, of course, the United States wins the Cold War, and the Soviet Union disintegrates. And some of us are old enough to remember that. And I don't think we realized how incredibly lucky we were that a superpower with 20,000 nuclear warheads could fold rather peacefully, not a single nuclear warhead going missing, and more or less the entire social, economic, public health, public safety, etc. cost borne by Soviet society. And then, with the United States as the only superpower, well, then we have a unipolar order. And when there's no security competition between superpowers, then the hegemon can pursue whatever follies, whatever interests it has. And of course, the ideological interest of the United States was spreading democracy. So that's why we have what many people talk about, a liberal order. These organizations that were Western organizations before could expand. GATT could become the World Trade Organization, the European Union, NATO, etc. could expand. And what did that mean for the Arctic? Well, that meant that we got what I would have called an Arctic liberal order. Liberal in the sense that it was not concerned with traditional military security, but it was concerned with topics as sustainable development, climate change, scientific cooperation, indigenous people's rights, and the like. And we got these organizations, which we all appreciated very much, the Arctic Council, the International Arctic Science Committee, regional organizations like the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, cooperation in the Bering Strait, the University of the Arctic, not to be confused with our employer, but the University of the Arctic, this consortium of about 200 universities, where I think 50 of them used to be Russian. So that was the end of history in the Arctic. But of course, the problem about the end of history was that history kept going. So we had this, we had the argument about the end of history and the last man, Francis Fukuyama, etc., as many of us remember. And there I would say that this globalization we had, it was resting on American unipolarity and hegemony. And by globalization, I basically mean market integration. The problem was that history didn't end, history rather returned. And I would say that globalization undermined this US unipolarity and hegemony, because it greatly facilitated the return of Asia to its historical place in the world economy. Some people talk about the rise of Asia. I think that's misleading, which I'll show in a moment. First, of course, we have the Japan and the flying geese, the spectacular economic growth they present in the after-war year. And then since Deng Xiaoping's open-door policy from 1978, we've had this incredible economic growth in China. And then we also have seen, of course, Russia basically return as what I would call a traditional Eurasian great power. And that is a very difficult situation, but that's probably, the long-term historical normal. At some not so long time ago, I heard an American historian of China say that over the last 2,500 years of human history, China has been the world's largest economy for 2,000 years. And Russia has probably been a Eurasian great power since Peter the Great, something like that. And that's something we'll have to deal with one way or the other. To illustrate these changes, let me show these two images. The illustration on the left I stole from Niels, who is from Eyit, who's sitting here, and you forgot your reference, so that's why there's no reference to it. But as it says, there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. And some people here know Asia enormously well. I have lived in Japan, visited China many times, and of course what you notice when you come from small Nordic countries are the enormous numbers of people. So, and all other things equal, economic activity should equal demography, especially over long term. So of course, if Asia represents more than half of the world's population, well then it probably should also represent more than half of the world's economic activity. And that is, of course, what it has done historically. So that graph is from the Asian Development Bank in Manila. So that's in quotation marks our development bank, and not in quotation marks their development bank, the Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And of course it shows that before the 1800s, Asia represented more than half of global economic output. Now, of course, the world economy today is almost infinitely much greater than the world economy in 1700. And then, of course, we've had imperialism, world wars, etc., which greatly strengthened the place of the West in the world and greatly reduced the place of Asia and other parts. But we both had, so I was just talking about the end of the Cold War. I mean, we've enjoyed 30 years of American unipolarity and hegemony, 30 years that are coming to an end, and we've enjoyed 2-3 centuries of Western predominance. And both American unipolarity is perhaps coming to an end, and this Western predominance is perhaps coming to an end. And that is something which is very, very challenging for the United States and for the West to get its head around. I also say that to students. So I'm born 1975, so in 2050 I hope to be a happy and healthy retired professor. But students can ask themselves how old they are in 2050. And of course this basically means that they will live their entire working life in a world where Asia becomes 50% relatively more important. So use every opportunity to visit Asia, use every opportunity to stay in Asia and study Asia. Okay, so I think it's also clear that the United States is absolutely determined to preserve this post-Cold War unipolarity and hegemony. We see that with the Trump tech trade war against China, which of course the Biden administration continues. And here I refer to work by a postdoc at our university, Maria Kopseva, that the United States is unable or unwilling to keep China and Russia in this unipolar post-Cold War order. And that has a lot to do with that the United States clashes with China and Russia about what China considers political and territorial core interests, of course, the rule of the Communist Party and Taiwan, and Russia about security interests, and that's, of course, NATO expansion. So I am very concerned, it's a dispassionate academic expectation, because, of course, what we are seeing is that the United States is a very, very, very formidable country. So instead of, seeing the end of unipolarity, we may see unipolarity 2.0. But I do, and it's a deglobalized unipolarity, which I fear will be much poorer and much more violent than the first unipolarity. And I think we see that in inflation, in interest rates, and of course in great power wars, as the war in Ukraine, and also in closed borders between these orders, which we of course see very clearly in the Arctic right now. So to conclude, what does a post-global Arctic look like? Well, we have this absolutely horrible war in Ukraine, but of course Russia is not demographically, economically, scientifically, technologically a challenger to neither the United States nor China. So this is a Sino-American business. It is the United States and China that stand out as the world's by far two largest national economies, and therefore we are returning to a bipolar system. And that, of course, becomes realist again, because when you have two or more superpowers or great powers in security competition, you get a realist order instead of a liberal order. Now, the world is much more complicated today, so they have to take care of more things than just arms control. And I think we again start to see an American bounded order. These organizations that the United States uses to collaborate with their allies and clients. And we see it on the Chinese side with institutions as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative. And that, of course, raises the question, where does Russia end up in this Sino-American bipolarity? My expectation before the Ukraine war was that this would be driven by Sino-American competition and it would be much more gradual. And of course, this catastrophic breakdown of European security order has accelerated things very, very much. And I think it's very clear that Russia, of course, is in the Chinese order. We see this rupture of Russian, Western, scientific, political, economic ties, and Russia, of course, has nowhere else to turn than to Asia and to China. So I think we are back to a much more bipolar world order, and we are back to a bipolar Arctic. I think we are going to see a strictly divided Arctic, and I am extremely pessimistic for circumpolar Arctic cooperation, as we've seen the last 20, 30 years. And on that happy note, thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We have now half an hour. Before we have any questions, then I would like to ask Stefan Lundqvist from Sweden. I want to ask him to come here up and describe to us how he sees the situation in the north change when Sweden becomes member of NATO. How he sees the constellation within the Nordic high north change with Swedish membership of NATO.
Okay. This is not well prepared, so we take it a little bit ad hoc. Stefan Lundqvist, Swedish Defence University. Sweden, I think many know Sweden as a neutral state. And Sweden has been neutral since 1809 war, a disaster. Russia waged a war on Sweden, and Sweden lost 1/3 of its territory to Russia, which is now a territory referred to as Finland. But at the time, Finland was a term that was used only for, the coastal provinces of the eastern part of Sweden on the western coastline, Swedish-speaking provinces. So that has been a very strong thing, and Sweden, I would say, used, let's say, a progressive version of neutrality all the way into the 20th century. And we did it also in the First and Second World War. We tried to be a little bit internationalist under Branting in the 1920s and onwards, but you know how that ended, and we went back. So what was more known was we ended up being different from our Nordic neighbors. Finland became bound by the Friendship and Mutual Cooperation Assistance Pact with the Soviet Union in 1948. And Sweden decided to try to approach Norway and Denmark for a Scandinavian Defence Union. But we did have some different experiences from being neutral. Sweden made it quite well. Denmark and Norway became occupied by Germany. So we said, no way. So Sweden returned from Oslo, realizing that that option was closed. And we decided to stay on our own, be non-aligned, and having the opportunity to be then neutral in the case of war. We produced this kind of, let's say, profile. We had a very active foreign policy in the Cold War. And in the 1990s, when all ended, and we started to pursue the peace dividend, we also joined the European Union, or we applied for the European communities that became the European Union. And Sweden, faced the facts that it was growing into a common defence and security policy, which made Sweden not talk that much about neutrality anymore, because we became bound by the EU structure, and we started to stress that we were non-aligned. And we maintained that until very recently, on 18 May, when we, together with Finland, handed in our applications to join NATO. So what has been the, let's say, the situation up till then very recently is that we have had Norway being part of NATO, Norway being like a barrier to the north towards the Arctic, also a barrier to the west towards the North Atlantic, and we have Sweden in between, you know, the maps and all the thing, how geography looks like, and we have very much focused on the Baltic Sea and the Baltic Sea region, and of course Russia has been a predominantly dominant feature in Swedish strategic thinking. And then we have Finland, and also we have closed up after Ukraine, everything changed. And we have to thank Finland for helping us make this move, because the dominant narrative, why shouldn't Sweden apply for membership in NATO, was Finland. I mean, we weren't on a line, we wasn't on a line, but still we cooperated that closely with NATO that it became, well, very integrated as an extended opportunities partner. With Sweden now, and I'll not talk so much about Finland, even if we have a very common history, what is changing now is, in this period, when we thought about being a partner, we thought about Sweden, and we thought about what could Sweden bring to NATO in a region and in the world. And then we had the northern flank, we were not part of NATO, and that was NATO business. And we did cooperate, and we did contribute. And we have this cooperative security idea about a network of security cooperation, with everybody working together. We also realized that being a partner, never mind how extended opportunities you have or how deeply you work, we realized that also Ukraine was an extended opportunities partner, and NATO security guarantees didn't apply. So Finland had a point convincing Sweden about it, because that is how it was. Sweden convinced Finland. Finland convinced Sweden to apply for NATO membership. So the consequences then is that Sweden is now preparing to become a full NATO member. We are waiting for Hungary. We are waiting for Turkey to make the final decision to ratify the accession protocols. But we are not waiting for that in Sweden. We don't have a time to wait for Erdogan's election in May next year. We are doing everything we can to prepare for becoming a NATO member. And then suddenly the whole perspective, the whole outlook on the region changes, because Sweden will not contribute to NATO. Sweden will be NATO. Finland will be NATO. And then as we start to look at the map on the Scandinavian peninsula from a military strategic perspective, it is a one whole, and it's at a geostrategic crossroads. And we have drawn some lines on the map, and they represent the borders between Sweden, Finland, and Norway. But we realize that if we're going to be NATO, suddenly the North Atlantic is a NATO responsibility, the Arctic is a NATO responsibility up there, and it's also our responsibility. For me, this is the first time I'm in Iceland. I have never been here. And maybe this also as a sign of what is happening. Because suddenly, if we are NATO, and we also are part of the entire Scandinavian peninsula together, security-wise, well, it doesn't stop there. If we're going to prevent something in the Arctic or from the North Atlantic and whatever happens in Murmansk, which is really the core thing, well, we realize that also Iceland is very important for the security of NATO. The Faroe Islands is also very important. Denmark is important. Sweden will be part of this. So these dynamics is changing. This is a sea change in the Swedish mentality. We are no longer pursuing it. We are not going it on our own, not just in the EU. We're also heading towards being part of NATO, and that is a big thing. And we are preparing now. We are very interoperable, I can say that, but still more things to go. We are considered about things like NATO Joint Squad Bronson, taking care of mainly the Baltic Sea. That's how we have kind of cooperated closely. We realize that Norway and the High North, like that, is to a certain extent a Norfolk, Joint Force Command Norfolk thing. And we are thinking about how to integrate here. So command and control is one important thing. And you know, Sweden is joining with no preconditions. And you can read it out as full. We don't have any preconditions. We are not setting up any barriers. We are willing to discuss what is needed when we are becoming members. So, questions, maybe.
Thank you very much. Well, we have some time for questions. If there are any questions, we have a microphone, and please raise your hands and state your name up there, please. Yes. Ja, kom igen.
I will begin with my questions anyway.
Här är det.
Yes. Do you hear me now? Yeah.
Louder.
My name is Thorlaugur Einarsson. I'm a student of Arctic Studies at the University of Reykjavik. No, Iceland, in Reykjavik. My question is, I guess, directed in a Danish direction. Concerning the possibility of independent Greenland from Denmark, security-wise. I know this is a political and speculative question, but could you foresee a Danish involvement in the defenses of independent Greenland based on some kind of agreement, or is this something that has been contemplated already? Thank you.
Thank you. I will take some questions, and then we have the answers at the end. Are there more questions? Up there, please.
So my name is Valur Gunnarsson, historian and writer. So 8-9 months ago, everyone was worried about Russian aggression, but now when we've seen the extent of Russian capabilities, perhaps we should be less worried than we were before. So with all the Arctic Council countries, bar Russia being in NATO and Russia being now confirmed as a second-rate power, which can maybe irritate but not pose a credible threat, should we be less worried? Is the Arctic more secure?
One more.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Duffing, and I'm at the American Embassy here in Reykjavik. And I'm curious, many of you have spoken about the increased focus on security in the Arctic, particularly in the wake of Russia's actions in Ukraine. But I'm curious because obviously many of the countries involved in the Arctic have a lot of other priorities, and so the increased focus doesn't come in a vacuum. And I'm curious, in your opinion or in your view, what is this increased focus coming at the expense of? What is having to give in order to create this increased focus on security?
Thank you. Shall we have the answers now? Who will start? Rasmus, please.
Yes, you can hear me. So the first question about the Danish role in the defense of independent Greenland or the Faroe Islands. With my personal background from Iceland, I am absolutely convinced that eventually we will see a fully independent Greenland and the Faroe Islands. I mean, imagine 100 plus years ago, everybody in Copenhagen was laughing at the idea of independent Iceland. And I mean, look at society today. It's also very flattering to say that Denmark defends anything in the North Atlantic. The Danish armed forces, they do incredibly valuable Coast Guard duties, etc. But I also think it's clear that the North Atlantic has been a part of an Anglo-American sphere of influence at least since the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, since the loss of the Danish-Norwegian fleet, 1801, 1807, to Britain, something like that, of course, Denmark, the Danish-North Atlantic connection has been completely at the mercy of first Britain and then the United States. Worry about Russian capabilities. Yes, I mean, the Russian conventional forces have, of course, spectacularly failed in Ukraine. I've heard high-ranking, I have no military background myself, I cannot evaluate these technicalities. I've heard high-ranking NATO officers say that the Russians were also very, very unlucky in the very first days, And if things had gone differently, we could have been in a very different situation now. But of course, we are seeing enormous destruction of Russian conventional capabilities, which it will probably take a long time for Russia to re-establish. The question about other priorities, well, I think it's important to keep in mind that in the Arctic we have, if we look at the 8 Arctic states, these are very different states. I mean, we have a superpower, the United States, which is globally engaged. We have Russia, some kind of great power, which of course is also very much engaged in the Middle East, in Africa, etc., etc. Canada, which I would qualify as a middle power, and then we have 5 textbook small states, the Nordic states. And of course, these Nordic small states, well, the Arctic and the Baltic are their core interests, and then they have been in many ways globally engaged, UN, development aid, etc., etc. But of course, for the 5 Nordic small states, the core interest is basically the Baltic Sea and the Arctic. Thank you.
I can't say anything about the relationship between the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland, so I won't say anything about that. But on the 2 other questions, so of course, as Erasmus points out, Russia has demonstrated its conventional strengths to be far less than we had originally anticipated, both in terms, I guess, of the actual materiel, but also the training and capacities of the troops. And it's almost like we're seeing them throwing bodies back in, like, the Battle of Stalingrad or something like that. So it's quite a dismal scene, and unfortunate for the Russian people, to be seeing that. But to the degree that they're allowed to know the extent of that. But what is a problem, of course, is, and this is where I see Erasmus's point with regards to the orders, and definitely see that there's been a changing of world orders over time. And the Arctic has definitely reflected that. But Russia as a returning Eurasian power, I'm a little bit more skeptical too, except for the fact that it has a nuclear power, or nuclear weapons. I mean, that's its the trump card, haha. But that's what it has. So that's the only thing really, because it's the way Russia has been acting. It wasn't always articulating its interests in terms of definitely about security, but not necessarily in terms of NATO as a threat. That is something that has increased over time. So that's more of a dynamic process. As a matter of fact, understanding security either in the Arctic or amongst these Arctic states cannot be seen in a static kind of position. And that's why I'm not a fan of this Arctic exceptionalism that tends to reify a type of a relationship. It actually has been quite dynamic. From my perspective, Russia is rather scary because of the fact it's not a great power. It's a declining power, and it's faster declining. We can say that the United States may be declining, but it's a faster declining power and has been for the longest time, both with regards to population and its capacities economically, heavily dependent on China. So it's a question of what is the current regime willing to do to maintain a certain status, and it may be that it literally will pull out, or at least it's threatening to pull out the big guns, whether or not, because it would be to their detriment also if they use nuclear weapons. So that's Russia is actually more frightening in a way because it's so weak, relatively speaking. So I think that's something we need to keep into consideration. I think that's exactly what has been on the table also. How do we keep this power that actually articulates fear more than anything else, but fear for its own weaknesses and its losses, both at the time of the end of the Cold War, but also this notion of empire, which it also has had along the way in various degrees, and there's a historical trajectory there. So that's the one thing. And the increased focus on security in the Arctic. It's interesting because this is where I'm perhaps not an outlier, but if we define security in the narrowest of terms and in sort of a militarized, the use of military might to protect borders, and that's what security is about, and then whatever else is about everything else, one could say that we do see an increased focus on the militarized aspect of security to the detriment of, for example, a focus on climate change. However, I would say that there has also been a recognition that climate change is a part of the security picture. So if you take a more comprehensive security understanding, which isn't limited to a militarized, and which is often linked up with sort of state security, then you see a broader picture of security. And I think actually there is a recognition that while there is a focus on, you know, putting the money in towards, you know, reaching 2% or going over 2% and beefing up militaries, particularly in Europe and in the NATO alliance, that we cannot ignore climate change. And this is also why I focus on the thing that a lot of people don't necessarily focus on in traditional state security or militarized security sense, is the fact that where our focus is, to a certain degree, also taking a look at the roles people play and the security people have in their own communities, and being cognizant of that, because that in itself is actually instrumental to whether or not there's an increased capability of trying to destabilize states from within. So I think we're seeing multiple lines of understanding of security, and this isn't for securitizing or militarizing all of these lines. We can't militarize climate change, we can't militarize the civilian domain, but understanding that there are nevertheless these existential threats that lie in these domains that require different measures to be able to address them. And it's that complicated picture, I think, that we're taking a look at today.
Yeah, but...
Yeah, wow.
Short answer.
Okay, short answer. Danish defense in Greenland. Yes, but no, but. It's a tricky question. Whether Denmark have obligations towards Greenland in a potential post-independent future has also been a very live and real discussion in Inatsisartut, the Greenlandic parliament. And I think it's almost so, and sorry, it's a good question, but it's almost so hypothetical, so it's difficult to answer, because if Greenland was fully sovereignly independent, and I don't agree with Rasmus, I don't see necessarily Greenland or Faroe Islands being independent like Iceland, and I don't know why they necessarily would want to be. That's my personal opinion. They can do whatever they desire to, but I'm not sure that that would bring much benefit. I don't see why then Denmark should have a defense, a navy sailing around Greenland. So that's a question, why should they do it? What should be in Denmark's interest? And I think that there was a discussion with, no, that's too long. But many of the politicians talking for Greenlandic independence do not talk for a complete disassociation to other countries. And right now, it's not only Denmark that defends Greenland, it's also the US. And there's sort of a division of labor. The US is sort of guaranteeing nuclear, it's part of the, well, Greenland is a central part of the defense of North America, right? So in that respect, the US guarantees the defense or helps the defense of Greenland. The Danish defense force is present and doing an awful lot of other things. Would they want to do that in an independent Greenland? Probably not. But is there another constitutional agreement? Probably, maybe yes. And there's most Greenlandic politicians that I can think of right now talking for independence say, yes, we need some agreement because we don't want to do all this ourselves, so we can't do it ourselves. That was a long answer.
Two last questions. Trøsti.
Well, my name is Trøsti Valsson, Professor Emeritus at this university. I think it's the most important and interesting point in our discussion here is the creation of a new bipolar world, China, the West. And Ukraine helps a lot in that. in creating that, because the West has pushed the Russians into the bosom of China. And China is investing heavily in Siberia, as does India, transporting coal, gas, and oil from there. And I actually wrote a book about this 16, 17 years ago. It's called How the World Will Change with Global Warming. You can read it on my homepage. I would like to ask, one point there is very important, is that the receding of the Arctic sea ice from the Siberian coastline will mean much greater difficulties and challenges for the Russians in defending their borders. It's a new border for them to defend. And they are now already having full hands with the western border. And it will increase in terms of White Russia, and all those satellite areas states that will, I think, start to move now. And that will mean, I think, that the Chinese will have a unique opportunity to expand their activities to the north.
Well, we have 5 minutes. I will stop at 6 o'clock. So if you will answer this, and then we will, yes?
Hi, Jens Christian from the Faroe Islands, University of Faroe Islands. Question to Rasmus about the new world order as you envision it. The question is about, India was not on that map. Do you have any thoughts about that, about India's place in the future?
On? The last one.
Yes, starting and finishing. I just want to, because I have the chance now, Jeppe, to ask you about a little bit about Greenland, because we don't get that many chances here in Iceland to talk about the defense and security of Greenland. The reason I mentioned 2018 in my speech in the beginning was what is happening in Greenland concerning the airports, with the Chinese wanted to fund the new international airports, and we got the Prime Minister from Denmark the day after on the jet, and home rule fell, and then the letter came from the US concerning funding the airports. And also maybe a little bit about when the Chinese wanted to buy the old naval stations in Grundalen. And those were interesting. And then that was in September 2018. And maybe at the same time, we got the Harry Truman coming up north, the air carrier. A ship like that hadn't been here for 30 years. And Triton Juncture, now called, that was 2018, a call to response to 22, and Harry Truman was back then. And maybe for you, Rasmus, about the Polar Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative and all that, because actually we haven't heard much from 2019 concerning that from the Chinese.
Now you have the possibility to answer.
Yes.
Very short answer.
I'll try to do it short. I think the common reading of Chinese attempts to get involved in Greenland is that they are pulling back because it's too complicated. I mean, it's been quite clear that Denmark and the US are not happy, and therefore they will do a lot to prevent it, and there's a sort of a general acceptance of that. So I think there are much less attempts at the moment to actually get in, and there's a clear focus from the US to try to involve an alternative, and also from Denmark to prevent these things from happening. And now in the Danish defense, we have 2 men, I think, looking after the old naval station until somebody come up with an idea of what to use it for. It's also clear that I think that the US are interested in, together with Denmark, increasing surveillance, air surveillance, but also maybe increased radar surveillance, and there are constant speculations about the two radar. So I would expect an increased US presence and engagement in both, civil military cooperation, but also try to establish a presence and just be visible. I mean, I know of people who've been engaged in research projects involving Chinese, suddenly they have US partners. These things you see quite a lot.
Are you going to answer the question of the professor?
Very briefly first, Jens Christian, about India. I mean, in this bipolarity, of course, we also have the rest of the world, which are not particularly interested in being squeezed in this. You make me think about the voting in the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations General Assembly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is, of course, Russia vetoes in the Security Council, China abstains, that's not surprising, but India abstains and the United Arab Emirates abstains. And then you have in the General Assembly, you have 30, 40 states abstaining, and these abstaining states represent more than half of the world's population. And when I have the opportunity to talk about the Ukraine war with people from Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, we in the West, we have to be very, very realistic about our credibility. I mean, when we talk about rules-based order, when we talk about values, we don't have credibility. And we have huge parts of the world which see the world very, very differently from us. And before it didn't matter, and it matters more and more. The thing about China, well, the one thing that has surprised me about the Ukraine war is the extent to which the United States, through the threat of secondary sanctions, has been able to keep China from basically buying Russia. I mean, at this point, I thought Chinese energy companies had been much, much more invested in Russian resources that has happened. And I think the explanation is the US threat of secondary sanctions. Thank you.
Actually, I just follow up on what Rasmus said, just to emphasize that. And that is a very important thing, because when we are preoccupied about, say, security in the Arctic or security in the alliance and such, and the way the world has changed in terms of security, and we're doing these sorts of analyses, there's a huge chunk of the world that's not seeing it that way. And that's extremely important to take on board. And it's not just, say, China and India. Nigeria is predicted to be the second largest populated country in the world in a couple of decades. So we have the entire continent of Africa that does look at the security picture in the world patently different than the West does. Absolutely, because of credibility problems that the West has with projecting notions of democracy, but also just the relationships that these countries have had over history with both the West but other parts of the world. So these are things we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about the security picture, and not just get stuck in the Arctic either. We need to think about it globally as well.
But just give the panel a hand. We are. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for attending the seminar. There are some refreshments outdoors, and we can then continue our discussion. The session is over. Thank you very much.
That's our main priority. We know we must be positive. So that's fine. And the other thing
it's hard being the one with the butt at the end.